What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of a background, I suppose, and I'm hoping that this will link into what you already know, but also might kind of push you to think about some other things. In terms of disability studies and disability research globally, and how we might think different approaches across the world might approach these very tricky concepts of consent and capacity. I think Gillian did a brilliant job in terms of basically displaying how complex these ideas are. And I know that I'm in the company of people that will know a lot more about this legally and theoretically than I do. What I want to do is to consider 4 established approaches within disability studies: the social model, the minority model, relational model, and the cultural model. And I want to say a few things about where they come from, these models, and how they might approach these ideas of capacity and consent. Then what I want to do is to introduce you to 3 new emergent approaches, which would be framed perhaps in terms of critical disability studies. And in particular, I want to look at the contribution of CRIP studies, studies of ableism, and this stroke ability studies, because I think these new emerging ideas from disability studies further complicate, in a good way actually, what we might understand as capacity and consent. And of course, how we approach the researching disability. Is that okay? Right, so the four kind of established models within disability studies. Can I have a show of hands to the people who think they would, are okay with disability studies? Good, there aren't people, they're brilliant, that's good. Okay, so the 4 approaches are essentially a response to the kind of dominant ways in which disability is understood. Disabilities are often understood as a problem, a personal tragedy, an individual problem at that, and one that's very much located within the individual, medicalisation and psychologisation. What's these approaches that came out from Britain, the US, from Nordic countries, and also North America, were a response, an antithetical response to these dominant ideas of disability. The first one I want to talk about is the British social model of disability. This is a picture of my daughters before GCSEs took over their lives. And that's with Karl Marx. This is on the day that the last royal wedding was on. They were very furious. We dragged them away from a garden party, took them there, and made them do that. It's a form of abuse, actually. It's child abuse. Just to bear in mind that the British social model of disability, it came about from very Marxist leanings. Because what the social model does is it says something very, very strong. The disabled people are disabled not by their bodies, but by society. And more so than that, the disability itself is a construction of capitalism. One could also argue that ideas of consent and capacity are, of course, also imbued with capitalistic ideas, particularly around autonomy. But I think it's important to recognise the social model. What it did is it split impairment. People have impairments, but the key thing here is disability. That is the exclusion of people with impairments. The social model has been absolutely profound in its impact upon how we understand disability. Meanwhile, over the pond in North America, we have the emergence of what's called the minority model. And the minority model had basically brought together links between disability politics and black civil rights. And the argument here, quite simply, was that disabled people had been not given the opportunity for consent and had been conceptualized as lacking the capacity to consent. And what the minority model did alongside the social model in this country is it seriously contested that idea. So this idea of contesting these medicalising ideas around disability and consent come from these kind of strong disability perspectives. Over the last 15 years, we've seen the emergence of a relational model. A relational model of disability coming from Nordic countries. And the way to think of this is that we know that Nordic countries have very good welfare systems, or they used to at least, before austerity got involved. And the focus of disability consideration here was the idea that disability occurs when there's a lack of fit between the person and the environment. If we get the environment right, so the argument goes, then we can actually work with people in terms of their consent and capacity. And the fourth approach is a humanities approach. Again, back over the pond to North America, Canada, we have humanities scholars who suggest that disability itself is always being culturally produced. So the idea of capacity and consent themselves are cultural, nebulous ideas. What it actually means to consent would depend upon what you're consenting about at a particular time and in a particular place. And what the cultural studies approaches, I think, have done in a very positive way, is to always keep these ideas such as capacity and consent under the microscope, under investigation. So, in a very, very quick, basically simplifying 40 years of research, these 4 approaches to disability have got us to politicise it. And in politicising disability, inevitably we will politicise things like consent and capacity. I want to now turn to what I'm calling post-orthodoxy approaches that have come about in the last 10 years across the globe, which I think make things even more complicated, especially in relation to the ideas of consent and capacity. And the first one I want to introduce is the idea of crip theory. Crip studies emerges from North America as a celebration of disability and what disability does to normative ways of living. So just like queer in queer studies is a celebration of lesbian, gay, bi, trans identities as a way of contesting normative ideas, crip theory is a celebration of what disability does to normal life. Again, massively in danger of simplifying a huge body of literature. This, I think, is very interesting for us today, because the ideas of consent and capacity from a crip theory position would immediately take task with the very concepts. The idea of something like individual consent and individual capacity, crip theorists could argue, are normative ideas. They have to be in law, for example. But they're also normative in the sense that they refer to particular ways and particular kinds of giving consent and demonstrating capacity. Crip theorists, for example, would be interested in the ways in which disability challenges and disrupts what we might normally understand as consent. So, can one get consent from somebody with intellectual disabilities who cannot speak or apparently get across their view? And I know that looking through the book, this is a focus of some people in the room today. Crip theory would say, rather than arguing disability denies the opportunity for capacity or consent, it opens up different ways of doing capacity and consent. So capacity and consent are actually distributed phenomena. They're distributed across the kind of relationships that people have, regardless of how profound their impairments might be. In this sense, they would argue we need to crip consent. And I'd happily come back to that as a point later. The second approach is something called critical ableist studies. And ableism, the way to think of ableism is the desired citizen of our times, sadly, is not this person. This is Superman, because you're still not allowed really to have your pants on over your trousers. If you type in ideal man on Google, which I've done a number of times for a variety of different reasons, you do actually get that image. This is ideal man, people. He's white, he's just come back from work, he's done that thing that, heteronormative families do, the blokes in those families do. They just wait long enough to be at work to then when the kids are asleep. So don't do any parenting whatsoever, right? And of course, he now is enjoying the sleeping child, hasn't got to deal or engage at all with anything to do with the family. Now, what this, I think, catches very nicely is the notion of ideal man is at the heart of many of the normative legal frameworks and documents that we use. The law has to start with something. And one could argue that the law, or Western law at the very least, still has in mind the ideal citizen who matches the Vitruvian man. Yeah, this man of ideal proportion, or you're after a modern-day version, him. Should we look a little bit longer? Maybe lick his face. That's what I do. I wouldn't talk to him, I just would lick his face. Now, what this actually leads to is status anxiety. And one of the concerns that I would have from this critical ableist studies is to pose the question, is the idea of consent or the assumption of capacity itself an ableist framing. Yeah? Individual qualities inherent within somebody. It fits very neatly with Vitruvian Man. I'm not suggesting people here use this, but the way it is written into legislation, I would suggest, is that it's written in some deeply ableist ways, where ableism is, preferred ways of living your life, white, or Rosie Braidot puts it, white, Western, heterosexual man, speaking a standard language, living in towns. This idealized ableist citizen is at the heart of many of our kind of considerations of consent and capacity. The desired individual is cognitively, socially, emotionally able and competent, biologically and psychologically stable, self-contained, genetically sound and ontologically responsible. I didn't make this up, this comes from all this literature over here. Normal, sane, autonomous, self-sufficient, reasonable, law-abiding, economically viable or dull, and white, heterosexual, male, adult, living in towns, global citizen of Western Europe and North America. That, we know, is the idealized citizen on which many ideas of autonomy, consent, capacity is based. When disability enters the frame, it crips and contests these take-for-granted assumptions. Indeed, in order for you to demonstrate your capacity, try as much as you can to show that you are cognitively, socially, emotionally able and competent. Don't do what Gillian's just done, which is honestly open up about the complexities of human life. Keep that stuff quiet. And this, from the critical ableist framing, I think gets me worrying about consent. So I suppose, where do we go? Well, we go obviously to an idea that I've developed with my own colleagues. Why else would I be here than over to sell my own stuff? Our argument in terms of disability, dystroke studies, is it seems to us that we're in an interesting kind of contradiction and paradox in the disability world. In the sense that, take some of the work we do with groups of people with intellectual disabilities, mental handicap, as it used to be called. If you ask self-advocacy groups the things they desire, they're pretty normative ideas. They are your own home, living safely and well, a relationship. Yeah? These are quite normative desires that many people have. But in order for them often to get access to those kind of markers of competence, they do so in some pretty crip ways. That is, they do some pretty interesting disability activism work around ideas of capacity. A story that I like to use as an example is, I was in a self-advocacy group once. There's Julie sat down here, Dave and Joan. Dave says to Julie, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" Julie never spoke in all of the 10 months that I spent time with her. She had a particular label, didn't speak. And her friend replied to the question, "You're drinking coffee this week, aren't you?" Does Julie have any competence or capacity? She hasn't spoken. She hasn't responded directly to the request. I would argue there is capacity in the room. And we might call that a distributed capacity, a relational capacity, a relational consent. And actually, if you wanted to go for some consent or to trust somebody, it would probably be a good idea to start talking to Julie's best friend. But it seems to us that often we are not equipped with a kind of theoretical language or philosophical language for thinking in more imaginative ways about capacity and consent in precisely the ways that self-advocacy groups are doing. So if you like, our appeal to dystrokeability is to recognize the dis part of life, that disability comes along and it crips the world. It produces some exciting ways of rethinking such things as capacity. At the same time, with the ability recognition, is that many disability organizations, many disability groups have desires for these normative notions of capacity and consent and demonstrate them. But they often do so in some quite dissing, cripping way. So to finish then, some obvious truisms really. Capacity, consent and disability, these are complex and there's difficult interconnections. We are talking about human capacities, but one wonders if we're talking about individual competence, but at the same time balancing that with ideas of relational competence. As disabled scholars have been saying for many years, nobody is independent. Nobody's independent. We're all interdependent. We're all interconnected. We're all relational beings. This is what makes us human beings. And it seems there's any consideration there for something like capacity and consent, needs to be careful of not just falling into a kind of independence framing of that, but needs to be thinking about interdependence. And one of the things we could say is we are, in posing the questions today, we might find ourselves in a bit of a clash of politics. We live our lives undergirded by humanism. Humanism, the individual capacity to do things, to demonstrate that one is a citizen. In our austerity times, and think about your decision, austerity times, the only way to survive is to be independent or autonomous, or to try and show that as much as possible, as the welfare system pulls away from us and leaves us to hopefully work and shop enough to survive. And it seems as a disability comes in, and in a crip way, and asks us to rethink the humanism that undergirds how we understand these ideas of capacity and consent.